Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on leading during a time of crisis. Following on from the successes of our first two webinars on this topic, we are delighted to welcome Nigel Armitt to LIBF today. My name is Nadim Choudhury. I'm a careers and executive coach, and I head up the Careers and Employability Department at the London Institute of Banking and Finance. I'm also a lecturer on our undergraduate degree programs. It's fantastic to see so many of you online today. Before we start, please do let us know where you are dialing in from by typing into the chat box. This would just give Nigel and I a sense of who's online. Ipswich, Barbados. I'd really like to be there at the moment. Swindon, Bromley, Cheshire, Jersey. Okay, most people are from the UK. Someone's in Guernsey. Croydon. Dublin, Peterborough. Okay, as you can see, we have a lot of people from all over the UK, and we've got people from the Channel Islands and someone as far afield as way as Barbados. We've got Sandeep from India. So Nigel, I think it's going to be a really interesting and international conversation. So before we start, if you are having any technical issues, like sound issues or you can't see us, please check your speaker volume. It also helps to log in and out again, and that might help you to gain connectivity. Also, we've created a troubleshooting box, so a lot of the questions around technical issues can be answered if you just go onto the troubleshooting box and see if that question can be answered. If you're having any other issues, please do type into the box and a member of the events team will be able to get back to you. So, Nigel is our guest today, and I'll let Nigel introduce himself. I don't know about you, Nigel, but since we spoke about 4 weeks ago, things have changed significantly in our day-to-day lives. I, for one, have gotten used to the lockdown, and in particular, working from home. Many of us have adjusted our lives, and to some degree or another, I must say, there have been some challenges that myself and my peers have faced, particularly in line with the blurring between work and life. It's been very challenging. This naturally poses significant pressures on leaders in organizations. So we've got a lot to discuss today, and I'll try to keep the focus of our discussions from the point of view of a finance leader, and I'm sure that many of the points we raise will be applicable to everyone. But the key theme that I'd like for us to cover in the next 30 minutes or so are on questions surrounding the following. So how can banking leaders provide strategic leadership in their organizations? Some of the key interpersonal skills and strategies needed to develop credibility. How to lead global teams, motivate colleagues, create a sense of purpose. And really sort of a philosophical question about the new relationship between government, business and society post-COVID-19. But before we start the discussions and to get a sense of the expertise online today, can I kindly ask the participants to quickly take part in the following poll? So, Rox, can we get the questions up, please? And if we can publish those questions as well. Interesting. So that's the first question. Experience of managing large teams. It's kind of evenly split. Do you have experience of managing teams through a crisis? 34%, 37% yes, 67% no. Leading during, do you have experience of coaching others? 80% do, that's fantastic, okay? And do you have experience of managing and leading finance functions? Over 67% do. Okay, so as you can see, we've got a mix, but a lot of expertise online today. It would be fantastic if you guys can carry on those conversations in the chat box. So how will this work? Over the course of the next half an hour or so, Nigel and I will have a conversation. And at the end of the conversation, we will collate your Q&As at the end, and I'll try and field them to Nigel. Okay, so let's make a start. So Nigel, can you spend some time introducing yourself, providing some kind of context to our to our viewers and our participants on your background and experience and how you've helped banking and finance professionals?
Yes, certainly. I'm a career interim international CFO. I've worked in many different organizations. I've worked for over 30 years as an interim. I worked across all business sectors. I've worked for Barclays Bank, HSBC Bank, and I spent time working with the private equity European finance leasing company called Alpha Trains, which was located in London. However, we worked across Germany and Luxembourg and also in Holland. So we worked across, as I say, across the whole of Europe. I've helped many leaders in delivering major restructures, turnarounds, major change programs where an organization may have been relocating its head office, restructuring that organization, downsizing, reducing the budget by 50% or even more, going through a time of really difficult financial crisis. I often have been parachuted in different organizations where the current team in that organization has just not had the experience or the capacity to be able to deal with that difficult financial situation. And therefore, I found myself being right at the center of where those issues and that crisis is being dealt with, which in fact I see very much the COVID-19 current crisis as exactly the eye of a storm where we are in a turnaround situation. However you look at it, however you dress it up, it is a turnaround situation, and it's affecting so many different businesses around the world internationally, and businesses that before one would think were very financially secure, sound, they had a good business model, and basically they would not be affected by many other events that have occurred across the globe, I would say, whereas this is once in 100 years, this COVID-19 crisis, and it really has caught many different business leaders unaware. So I've worked, as I say, with all those different organizations, whether it's working with the board, coaching the staff there, working alongside the existing CFO or finance director, or in fact, that person being unfortunately removed in some situations because the board have not had confidence in the individual. And therefore it's been handed over to me for me to guide that organization through those difficult waters, as it were, in that ship, so that we come out the other side, we come out a stronger organization, more financially sustainable, and more prepared for the future, because of course organizations need to survive through difficult times, and therefore a turnaround, a COVID-19 really does make the management of the organization need to focus very clearly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that background expertise. It's I've actually just learned something. I would never have thought of this situation as your typical turnaround crisis, but actually it is, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It really is. I mean, and that's it. Although that word to some people has bad press with it, shall we say, or bad vibes, for want of a better expression, and therefore people don't like to use that word, it is the truth of the situation, and it is a financial turnaround, and that's exactly what it is. And with that comes the whole management of that project and the delivery of it. And I've done this in the NHS as well, where quite a few years ago the NHS in the UK, which is one of the largest public bodies, was going through a difficult time, wasn't funded sufficiently, and therefore many of the various organisations in the NHS were operating at a deficit, meaning they were spending more than they had budget for, or the income that they were receiving if they were a trust, a hospital, and that was quite something to go into an organisation like that. I mean, in that one particular organisation I went into, which happened to be in the eastern part of the UK, my initial interview for that role consisted of 26 people sat around the table. So it was the whole board, the non-execs, everybody asking me what could I do in that organisation and why should they choose me. So I must say that's the largest number of people I've ever had interviewing me for a particular role.
Well, that sounds very, very challenging. Okay, so based upon your background and experience, I'd like for us to move on to the next question. And you've alluded to some of these challenges, but can you sort of clarify what are some of the key challenges facing finance leaders in organizations now? I'm sure many of our participants would like to hear your thoughts.
Yes, and I'm sure a lot of these comments hopefully will resonate with the international audience. I mean, at the moment I'm working as a CFO in Amnesty International, which operates in 70, 80 different countries. So we are a very international business. I would say the number one issue, and it's facing all leaders now, is to appreciate that your number one priority during the current crisis are your employees. They are your key asset. And the reason I start with that is because every decision that you make as a finance leader in the organization needs to take that into account, and you need to appreciate who your audiences are, who's going to be affected by the decisions that you're going to have to make very quickly if that organization is going to survive. And it's the same situation where I'm sat now in Amnesty International as their CFO. So in a turnaround situation, as we've already mentioned, this situation at the moment, it requires sharp focus, and it requires you to focus on what your top priorities are. And I found my situation at Amnesty that one day I was working in the office, the next day we'd made a decision, as everybody else I'm sure on this particular call now appreciates, finding yourself working from home, which again is a complete change to your working environment. And I decided at that point to go home, and that evening when it was after my last day in the office, and quickly do a list, as most finance people do, I have to say, and resort to Excel and do a quick list on an Excel spreadsheet of what do I see as my priorities today, and then sort that and use that as my reference over the next few weeks. And I did use that at the beginning of this crisis, and I updated it regularly. I confess now that after several weeks of the crisis, I am not regularly updating it because I have too many other things to do. But initially, I found that a very good way to focus the mind. And what that did, it made me then communicate to the whole of the organization and make them appreciate that this is a classic example where cash is king, and that all the organizations now who are fighting for existence and wanting to survive, that they need to quickly get to grips with their cash situation, because if they run out of cash, you just will not survive. And COVID-19 has really brought this right to the front for me and made so many organizations that we're hearing on the internet. We're seeing it when you turn the television on and you look at the news. We're seeing, unfortunately, organizations going into bankruptcy, filing insolvent organizations because they have suddenly realized that they have not had healthy cash balances. And the same goes with your level of reserves. The reserves obviously is how much you can eat into if you're not making a profit as an organization, but it's the cash at the end of the day, and that's very important. And for us as an organization, Amnesty, we rely on 13 of our top sections for 93% of our income. So every organization different. So what we decided early on was that we needed to engage very quickly with those top 13 sections, as we call them, which is 13 different countries, and to bring them around the table remotely, just as we're talking now, and have a set of questions that we wanted to ask them. Are there going to be any delays in the way they're going to pay us? How do we plan for that? Are there any other issues that they're experiencing? More importantly, and I think this is the key part, if we look at the opportunities, what are they doing themselves to take advantage of this situation? So because they relied very much on face-to-face income collection, they had to quickly switch to digitization and quickly switch to other forms of income generation. And in fact, as some of those sections moved to that, countries, they were quite surprised on how effective that was. And I think that's something, again, that to me on a positive side has come out of COVID-19, that organizations have had to be very innovative and very flexible and very quick on their feet to adapt, to look for other opportunities, where perhaps in the past they would have not thought of implementing that. And I've read so many stories on the internet where organizations have had to be agile and very quick at moving to other methods, other methodology, ways of working, as we know, technology ways of working, which I'm sure you've all been affected by that. We're using Teams, of course, in the organization. We have used Zoom, but we found Microsoft Teams to be a particularly good IT platform. We use that right across the organization, and that has proved its resilience. It's worked. I have to say we've all been pleasantly surprised just how well the technology has withstood what's happened and where we've all been thrust into this situation. Because if you think about it, I'm sure when all this was put together, the technology and the people who put the software together, and in fact the internet, they never dreamed of any event like COVID-19 where we'd suddenly have billions of people relying on using the IT and working from home. I mean, it is such an unusual situation that we're all working in that situation. I would say another one of the going back to the actual challenges that finance are facing is that communication is absolutely at the forefront of everything that we're doing as an organization. And everything that I'm doing, whether it's talking to my own staff, whether it's talking to the stakeholders, to the board, to the trustees, to third parties like our suppliers, it is all around having a clear, succinct, and very transparent communication. And that is so important at a time like this, when if you do not give that clear message, then you will make people feel very fearsome and very concerned about the future of your organization.
Thank you so much, Nigel. And I'd actually echo some of those things. So, from what you said, the key thing that's come out from me is really sort of employees are at the heart of everything. And now it really is for leaders to focus on that and making sure that cash is available. The other thing that you mentioned, I think the term that I would use is it's innovation, and it's almost like organizations should have a Kodak moment, right? It's time for them to change and provide and think about providing new services and products.
Very, very much so. And IT are at the forefront of that, as you would expect. So my IT CIO manager is right at the forefront of that. So in a way, he suddenly sees it as an opportunity, as you can imagine, to pitch for more budget, because he sees that this is an ideal opportunity that he may not get again in the future, particularly if the organization is having to save costs, because it may have to change the way it operates. So he's seizing the moment, and of course, as a finance person, as you can imagine, that needs to be looked at carefully, as any new business case does, and therefore it isn't, if you like, an almost automatic green light, meaning that the budget is no problem, and therefore we don't mind, we can throw all the money we need to solve this problem. So there is an element of caution there, I would say.
Okay. So I'd like us now to move on to the question regarding the role of a finance leader in such a crisis. And you did mention, cash is going to be really important, but what are some of the key roles of a finance leader in this organization, and how can finance leaders position themselves as a trusted partner to say their CEOs and their boards?
That's a very good question. It's a question actually for me as a career interim. I always think about this from day one. And when when I saw the questions that we'd agreed between us we were going to ask on this call, I thought trust isn't something that you can suddenly, if you like, wave a magic wand and it suddenly happens overnight between your finance person and the CEO. In a way, I would say you have to, first part I would say you have to demonstrate it. You have to earn it. And I would say, in my experience with working with some really sharp CEOs, often they're very astute themselves. They're very financially savvy. And in my experience, they are often on the same page and sometimes ahead of the finance person, the CFO or the FD, and therefore it requires the CFO FD to be very sharp themselves, because if they're not, they will trip up, and there is a danger that in, say, well, it could be a senior leadership team meeting, or it could be a board meeting, or whatever. The CEO then could be perceived as the person that's perhaps more in tune with what's happening financially in the organization. And that's not a situation you want to be in if you're the CFO, the senior finance person. So I would say it's very important that to help you as a senior finance person, that you have a strong finance team around you, because you're only as good as your team. And it's a fact. So you can pretend that you know technically everything about finance. You can pretend you know how to deal with everything as the senior finance leader. But quite honestly, from my experience, if you've not got a strong team around you, you're exposed. You can't deliver everything. It's impossible to deliver all those tasks that you're expected to deliver, because you need to delegate. You need a strong team around you which will assist you and help you. I think another point I would say, and it was something I thought I'd do a quick piece of research on, is trust can be split into two elements, and I think this is important. So there's a cognitive trust element and an effective trust element. And the cognitive element is how confident somebody feels about you in the finance function. What's your technical ability to do the job, to deliver? Whereas the effective trust, or if you like, the trust of the heart, is built by empathy. That's more the touchy-feely part. It's the closeness and the genuine feelings of concern and care, the feelings of security. It's how you perceive the strength of the relationship, the degree at which someone's intentions are trustworthy. And another important point I think here is that if you as a finance person don't show a certain level of vulnerability, in other words, that perhaps finance, they're only human and they could sometimes get things wrong, I think it's important that you do that, because what I've noticed is by doing that, and building on that, there's a word transparency comes to mind as well, then that builds a very good rapport with all your customers that I see that finance serves, whether that, as I say, be the board, the trustees, even third parties, your donors, all those people, they look to finance. And at a time of COVID-19, I've noticed that finance is right at the heart of this crisis. And I've had to stand up in front of the staff during this crisis. I've talked to our directors. I've talked internationally on international calls. And they're all wanting to hear from the CFO. They want to know, what is the finance situation? What's our relationship with the bank? Have we got the right facilities in place? Do we have the right headroom to carry us through this particular crisis? And going back to my earlier comment, one of the key points that I quickly decided to focus on was to say to everybody that currently, or initially, I'm only going to focus on the next 12 months. It's the short-term, immediate period. So therefore, I'm not going to be focusing on 2021. I'm not going to focus on 2022. Initially, my focus is on 2020 to ensure that we can survive through that period. And that's what I did for the first period of my time in handling this crisis. Very soon after then, as conversations went on with the board, it switched and the agenda changed. And as I would expect, I had somebody on the board was saying, okay, well, that's all very well, but how is this going to affect us in 2021? How is it going to affect us in 2022? What mitigations are we taking to reduce the effect on us, to reduce the risk on us as an organisation?
Thank you so much, Nigel. I'd echo some of those findings as well. And it reminds me of some research that Dr. Connie Locke from the LSE took around sort of behavioral psychology and personal psychology as well. And there is lots of evidence out there to suggest that it's the paralinguistic, the things that you say in your tone of voice, how you communicate, even for finance professionals, how you communicate has a much more bigger impact than the actual numbers sometimes to gain that trust. So I can see parallels there. That actually brings me nicely on to the next question, and that is, I'm pretty sure everyone on the call has studied leadership at some point, but what are some of the key characteristics that finance leaders need to demonstrate? What behaviors do these finance executives need to display specifically during this time of crisis? You've mentioned empathy as being one key point, but is there anything else that you can perhaps share your insights on?
Yes, it builds on what you've just mentioned there, Nadim, which is it's how truthful, I would say, and the trust that your audience is having you as the finance person speaking. And I would say transparency is right at the top there, together with good communications, how you crafted your message. And on that point, I am a great believer that you write that script, you write that message first before you actually deliver it to the audience, and then you read it back to yourself, you play it through in your mind, and you think, does this explain really what the situation is? Is this in simple, unambiguous language, or is the jargon in here? And of course, as finance people, just like tech people, we are very prone to using a lot of jargon. And I would say at a time of crisis, jargon is not your friend. You should be steering clear of using jargon, and you should be keeping it very simple, because the more jargon you use, the more acronyms you use and so on, your audience won't understand that, and that will confuse them. It will leave them feeling nervous, and one of the things you want to show is decisiveness in your decision making. You want to avoid nervous employees becoming divisive and unsettled. I think that's very important. I would say you need to show calmness, credibility. You need to show visibility across the organization. That's obviously more difficult in lockdown, without stating the obvious, but having said that, the tech is there, and as I'm talking to you all now, you can still be visible across the organization. That's all about organizing those various meetings that can be virtual meetings, that you are communicating to the right groups of people. You need to hold regular updates. I would say that's a behavior that's very important. There's a balance there, because of course too many updates and you might not have something new to say, and you don't want to sound like a broken record. You don't want to sound as if, well, I don't have any new news and therefore I'm going to tell you what I've already told you last week, because the audience will switch off. So you need to keep it fresh. You need to keep it credible. I mean, one of the points that I did in my message very early on is I put myself in the shoes of the staff, and I thought to myself, what will be members of the staff thinking now? And I thought, well, the number one surely is, am I going to be paid at the end of this month? Is the payroll going to work remotely? Bearing in mind now we've suddenly moved out of our offices in London. Number two was, are all our suppliers going to be paid? Is that working? And therefore, they were the sort of questions that then I answered in my presentation to allay everybody's fears. And then once I'd said that, what I found then is they were not questions that were asked again by the staff, because basically you told them once, well, everything's functioning. Payroll will run at the end of this month as normal. Suppliers we've already spoken to, our key suppliers we've engaged with. Therefore, our key suppliers will be operating as normal. And the same goes with your customers. The same goes with donors. If you're an organization that relies on donors or sponsorship, it's very important to engage with all those people. And I would say that's key, and you need to do it early on. I found one of our largest donors, who the last time I met him was last year when we had a global assembly, was in South Africa. he actually reached out and said he wanted to have a half-hour call with myself to get a complete finance update on how Amnesty was faring, what's happening in the current COVID-19 crisis. That, to me, was very important, that I took time out and had that conversation, gave him confidence that I was handling the situation, that he'd got no need to worry. These were the areas that we were covering. This is how we're operating as an organisation. Again, something I've not touched on, as I'm sure many organisations are working the same way. We have our own crisis incident management team that meets weekly. Key decisions are made there. Security, which reports into me, is part of that. Technology is part of that. My area, of course, which is all the back office and finance, of course, has become key to the COVID-19 crisis. So all these back office areas, where before perhaps people had taken them for granted, they've suddenly become right at the forefront, just like HR, human resources, very important in the current situation. So all of those are very key. I'd say that it's key that we all meet as a tight team. That's the whole management team. We all need to be talking with one voice. It's key that we're all saying the same thing. We don't want mixed messages, because if we do that, then that's going to confuse people. It's so important that we do that.
Thank you so much, Nigel. My key takeaway from that was to communicate, and communicate clearly and regularly, to have visibility, and you can do that through technology. And just a few minutes ago, you mentioned about talking to suppliers, sorry, your donors. That to me is about stakeholder management.
Yes, it is, very much so. And one of the issues there, and I found this, is where you have more than one set of stakeholders. I mean, we have Amnesty International, we have a charity, we have Finance and Audit Committee, which I'm sure everybody's aware of in terms of our governance. We have a board. There are so many groups of people there that the problem is, how do you keep all those groups of people all up to date at the same time? That is quite difficult to juggle with. There is a balance. And the danger is that if you do not keep everybody up to date, you will find yourself sat in a meeting one day when somebody, of course, says, well, I wasn't aware of that. Nobody's updated me on that. And then you find that you're perhaps not so popular then because you've not kept them up to date.
Right. So we can now move on to, and you mentioned this, all of us are working from home. Leaders really need to deploy different strategies. What are some of the key strategies leaders can use to motivate their teams when working remotely and sort of lead with purpose?
Okay. Key for me was keeping my contact with my team. I've had regular meetings with the team. Initially, I'd have regular meetings with my direct reports. I have that in my diary, so I have a weekly conversation with those direct reports. I ask them how they are. I ask them how the team's performing. I ask them about the well-being, which I know we're going to touch on later on one of the questions. I also have an all-directorate meeting so that everybody can come together. We have an agenda for that, which we've agreed together. Another key part is that keep them informed so we don't lose trust, because, of course, while you as a leader are busy in all your meetings, the rest of your team, of course, one needs to appreciate, are not sat in those meetings. And even more, whereas perhaps where you were all in one office, and, I would often do this, could walk past somebody's desk and say, well, I've just been in a meeting with technology or with the senior leadership team, and we've just made X decision. I just need to let you know about that. It is so much more difficult when you're sat at home and you've just come out at back-to-back meetings to remember everything that's happened in those meetings, all the decisions that have been made, what the actions are, and then to be able to cascade that down to your team and keep everybody informed. So it requires a lot of discipline. You need to be supportive of your staff, as I say. Positive feedback. I mean, even though we're in a remote situation, I don't lose fact. The other day we had to do a very quick reforecast for the current year. That was turned round by two of my staff within 24 hours. They came up with an initial skeleton, if you like, of what that could look like. and I was able to present that to my senior leadership team, I immediately fed back to them and thanked them. And I said, this is very, really thank you for how fast you've responded. You've turned this around in a short space of time. This is really great. I appreciate you put the work in here. This shows, how agile we are, how responsive we are as a finance team. But, I'm not forgetting that. I just want to thank you for what you've done here, and I appreciate it. That one shouldn't forget that, and it's very important that we recognise that we should recognise achievements. That's something else that we've done as an organisation. We've decided that on our team meetings now, we don't just talk about the tasks, and it's task orientated. On the next meeting that we've got on Thursday of this week, we've decided we need a spot in there when we talk about achievements. Let's shout about those. Let's pat people on the back. What achievements? What have we achieved during this difficult time now? And then let's go around the table for each team and say what achievements, and then perhaps mention some of the people who've been the key people who've delivered some of those achievements in difficult times. It puts them in the spotlight, and that to me really motivates those individuals and makes them feel that they're really adding value and they're worthwhile to the organisation.
I totally echo that as well, and I think it's really important to have some good news. You may not, in your own department, if you're a leader in your own department, you may not think that this good news is worth sharing with the rest of the organisation. There's a lot of goodwill among employees at the moment, and they want their organisation to succeed, so they do want to see good news coming out as well.
Yeah. Can I make it? There's a quick question I've just seen from somebody on the chat, if I may, Nadim. I've seen a question from Indrajit, if I've said that correctly, who's asked, what do you mean by showing vulnerability? Could you please explain? Vulnerability, I feel, is showing openness and showing, as I was trying to articulate, that that you're a human being, that you might that you might make mistakes, that your finance department might make mistakes. You learn from that. That to me is what vulnerability means. Not showing that none of us make mistakes, that we're all perfect, shall we say? We can all walk on water. That's not the situation.
Brilliant, thank you so much. We're now going to move on to the question of COVID-19 and your reflections on how this will sort of change businesses, and maybe focus on sort of the area of corporate governance, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting that you've just said that, corporate governance. Amnesty, probably, in the audience, you just explain to the audience, is one of the most governed organisations I've ever worked in. That comes from a fact that many of the people in the organisation are themselves lawyers, and the organisation has been set up just like the United Nations. All our individual countries have their own boards, so they themselves are able to make decisions. I mentioned before we have a Finance and Audit Committee. We have a large governance team. We have a global assembly, which occurs once a year, which is normally a face-to-face event when everybody comes together. Obviously, this year that won't be happening. It'll probably be a virtual event. And to get back to your question, governance at a time of COVID-19 is extremely difficult and challenging, because I find as a finance leader, I'm grappling with how do we make decisions? How do we start to implement some of the changes, some of the things we need to do without going through the strict governance pathway, should I say. So therefore, I'm having to think, how do I cut corners without somebody saying that I'm completely ignoring what good governance is? So that means that I do reach out, I talk to the governance team. It does mean that, in my view, that you hold more emergency, perhaps, senior leadership team meetings. You hold, as we have at the weekend, we had a board meeting on Friday and on Saturday, which was to discuss COVID-19. And now the board has made a decision at the weekend that they want to hold monthly board meetings, which is not how we would normally operate. So that's even more governance. They also talk about having a smaller committee which reports into that board, and perhaps that should be very much COVID-19 focused. But of course, with all this I think there's a cautious, to me, I become a little bit concerned that if we end up with too much governance and too many meetings, then maybe we're ending up spending too much time in meetings and we're not spending enough time implementing and actually solving what the COVID-19 is causing the organization. And therefore, it goes back to what we started, I would say, this call with, which is this is a turnaround situation. And if I think about what happens in a true turnaround situation, speed is of the essence. And therefore, there are times when you cannot be totally consultative, perhaps not totally consultative without, ignoring the human side of the business with your workforce, and that you've got to make some hard, fast decisions quickly for the good of the organization so that the organization survives. And of course, you've got to play into that organizations that may have unions. I mean, we have a union, so therefore any decisions that we make that may have an implication on our staff, and maybe that could lead in the longer term to redundancy. If it did lead to that, then of course we need to have a conversation early on with the union, because that's part of the negotiation. That's how we work as an organization. So it's not seeing governance as an enemy, it's working with it as a friend, but recognizing that it can't get in the way so that perhaps it puts the organization at risk of surviving through COVID-19, Nadim, is what I would say. There's a fine balance.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like us now to move on the conversation regarding your role within the finance function of a leading NGO and charity. The impact of the crisis on the charity sector. Are there any reflections from Amnesty International that we in the banking and finance industry can learn from? And from a philosophical point of view as well, there's a lot of talk at the moment about a realignment after this crisis, shifts from individualism to collectivism, a greater sense of purpose for business and society. Can you kindly give your reflections on some of those issues, please?
For us, as I say, just to paint the picture, we were actually this year, I joined Amnesty last year in June. Last year was, for Amnesty, the first year of a financial recovery. So the irony is this year was also a continuation of that financial recovery, which I was overseeing as the CFO. So along came COVID-19, which unfortunately then added to that financial recovery. So to answer your question, it then for us as an organization prolonged that financial recovery. And whereas we were hoping that we were coming out the other side as an organization that was in a stronger position, financially sustainable, and able to look to the future, COVID-19 has not been something that we welcomed, obviously. And it's meant that we've had to revisit our cost profile. By that, what do I mean? We've had to look at how we're structured operationally, having to look at what our costs are, which is revisiting areas which actually as an organization we'd already visited last year. And in any of these situations, it's painful, it's difficult. We already had cost savings that we were making. We had a cost-saving committee, which I chaired as the CFO. We were all already making savings on travel and events. And in fact, it's ironic that because of the working from home and not operating from the office, that has led to automatic cost savings in the travel and events area. And therefore, what we've done as an organisation is the senior leadership team have discussed what the potential size of some of those savings are, and how long we think we'll be able to continue to set those savings to one side, ring fence them, and we've decided to recategorize them and put them into what we've called a COVID-19 pot for contingencies, so that we can then allocate those savings, which were previously obviously in the 2020 budget and had been approved by the board last December to be spent. But now we're saying they will be, they can be requested by different parts of the organisation, or the senior leadership team themselves may decide to utilise that budget. As an example, we talked about innovation. That's an area where we would use some of that money in the IT innovation space, so that if we're receiving requests that we need to change certain software in certain areas to improve the way we work as an organisation, then we need to think about that. We need to see if those business cases are acceptable. Do we sign them off and fund them from this now amount of money that we can release? In terms of the income model, for us as an organisation, in 2020, the effect on us is going to be on some of the sections and larger sections perhaps being later at paying us because they themselves may have liquidity issues, and we've already had conversations with some of those boards, or they may themselves feel that they're not able to pay us the amount of money they thought they were going to pay us this year. The real effect for us as an organisation, we've already come to identify, is that the effect is in 2021 and 2022 moving forward. So therefore, this comes back to why I was focusing as a CFO initially on the next 12 months, the 2020, because I knew, with my knowledge of how the organisation functions and operates, that it was the next 12 months which was key to our financial sustainability. And those are where my conversations with the bank have been, which you all relate to in terms of discussing with them what facilities we need, providing them with cash forecasts. We've been doing all sorts of cash forecast scenarios. We're doing the same on our forecasting for 2021 and 22. We're currently putting together a 5-year forecast as well. We produce a budget for the next financial year, which is 2021, and then a four-year high-level budget for the following years. So that's how we're operating as an organisation. We're working very closely with our top 13 sections. The reason we do that is they represent 93%. So that's 93% of our annual income, which obviously means if we get that right and we know exactly what's happening with those sections, then what's happening with the other 7% is of less importance. We are focusing on those top sections. So that's what we've been doing. Could you just repeat the other second part of your question, Nadim, about the that you asked?
Yeah, sure. So the question really was shifting from individualism to collectivism, and a greater sense of purpose for society based upon, Amnesty International's vision and mission.
There's been a discussion we've just had this morning very much on that, and without getting too political, obviously one of the key areas there is we've seen, of course, that certain countries have been persecuted, and governments have seen COVID-19, unfortunately, as an opportunity to persecute certain countries. And now we see that organisations, countries rather, and governments are making decisions on using apps for tracking people for purposes of finding out, who we've been in contact with from a medical perspective, of course, so they can trace. But of course, with that comes the question of, do we as individuals and in the world, are we comfortable with that we're comfortable to be traced and know that our governments know, or those people who can tap into that information, how it's shared, know exactly where we are, who we've spoken to, where have we been. That is a big question, and I'm not going to answer that on this call. That's something which is a very philosophical question.
It is interesting you say that, and I'm very aware of the time, but I would like to add this as well. And again, without getting political, our government seems to be taking a bit of a centralized model to the tracing and tracking aspect, where if you take a look at countries in Europe and in Germany, in other countries, they've taken a decentralized approach. So it'll be interesting to find out the science on why they've done that. Anyway, but that's my take on.
Yeah, can I come in with a quick answer, Nadim, on another question? Is it? It's from Nelika, if I pronounced that correctly. Yeah. Yes. How does this impact on the largest challenges we face in the organisation? How does it impact on strategic initiatives? That's a very good question. Again, ironically, we as an organisation were going through a refresh on our strategy, and that was not completely finalised and was about to be discussed at our face-to-face global assembly in July of this year, which because of COVID-19 that's been delayed, so therefore that itself has been delayed. The answer to this would be we've had to think about how does COVID-19 itself affect the vision and affect what Amnesty as an organisation wants to deliver. And I would say that's the same for every other organisation. So I would say that your strategy would need to be revisited, as we are doing, and thought about in a different way, and thought about, tested as, is it really still fit for purpose? Because when it was put together and thought through, COVID-19 was not on the horizon. So therefore, does it still tick the box? Does it still, is it still effective? And that's what I see. And the danger is, of course, as in I'm sure many other organizations, that you don't want to find that you're spending hours in changing, restructuring your strategy, whereas perhaps it's not that far from where it should be. It doesn't need so much attention paying to it. That makes sense, because there's so many other things that need addressing during the current crisis.
Okay. Right. Nigel, in interest of time, we've covered the questions about the future, and I'd like us to maybe focus on well-being and resilience. What can leaders do to support their staff now in terms of initiatives? What have you seen works really well? And then what we'll do is we'll wrap up our conversation and we'll try and answer some of the questions.
Resilience. I think resilience, if I think back to resilience to an individual, what makes an individual resilient? And particularly, I know that some people may have been affected because they've lost their jobs. What can they immediately do? How do they upskill themselves? So resilience is, I would say at a time like this, is don't take everything personally. Ask for feedback. Find a mentor. Get networking wherever you can, even in this difficult situation that we're all in lockdown. People are very IT savvy. People are still talking to each other. You must have a network. You must be able to reach out and talk to people. Don't be afraid of doing that. Don't give up. Stay positive. Keep yourself fresh. I think that's so important. I would say that, if you are feeling a little bit down and thinking, well, what do I do? There's so many online training courses that you can sign up for. Some of those are free. Think about what's going to increase your skill set, what's going to add value to your offering, to your either to your existing employer or a newer employer. Think about areas that perhaps before you hadn't had time to learn about. It might be an area that you thought, oh, I really wish I'd learned about that particular area because that would help me in my job, but I've never had time to do it. This is a fantastic opportunity at the moment to do that. Similarly, you might reach out, as Nadim and I know, to perhaps find yourself a coach and help yourself. Again, this is a good opportunity to do that. So I certainly, look upon it as an opportunity to do that, and don't feel isolated. That's so important, particularly if you're in a personal situation where, unfortunately, in this lockdown, you are on your own and you don't have that family and that extended network around you. That's so important, to reach out, talk to other people. That's so important to do that.
I would completely echo that as well. And a fantastic course that I found, which has been, and some of you may have already heard of it, Yale University have been doing a course called The Science of Well-Being, and you can do it for free. It's on Coursera.org. And it goes into the themes of positive psychology. That as a coach myself and helping other people, I found it to be invaluable because it puts things into context, and you can really learn some strategies in how you can cope yourself, but also provide that expertise to your employees. So I would completely echo those sentiments, Nigel. Okay, that brings us on to the end of our conversation. I've been asked by my events team if we can go on for 5 minutes longer. I don't have anything in my diary after this. Nigel, if you're okay, what I'd like us to do is answer some of the questions that we're now getting into in the Q&A. So we've had a question from Vinu Krishnan, who says, which areas of costs can a CFO focus when sales are affected due to lockdown and salaries can't be reduced, particularly when there is a possibility of social distance continuing for many months?
What comes to mind then, I'm sure I'm not telling Vinu something that they've probably not thought of, is are there any contracts that perhaps are coming to an end soon that need renewing? They may be, I'm just thinking like rent, any contracts with suppliers, fixed term contracts with staff, of course. As painful as it is, you need to be aware of any contracts that you may have that may be due to be renewed. That they should be on your radar. You need to have all that in front of you, because if you are deciding that you do not need to renew that particular cost line, then this is an opportunity to make that decision. After you've done all your fact finding, you've reached out in the organization to find out what the implications are if you did not renew that particular cost. That's definitely something to look at. Again, planning ahead, it might be something that you can't reduce some costs now, but when you analyze your cost profile, it could be a cost that you can't end perhaps now this month, but in 2 months' time you can stop that particular contract. Don't wait till then. You need to examine your cost profile now and look at what costs that your organization is incurring, that you may be able to pull that lever, even though that lever you can't pull until a month's time or 2 months' time. Obviously, the sooner you take action, the better. With this, you need to involve all your stakeholders. You need to involve the senior management team, and as with all cost saving, one of the key points is the longer you take to make a decision, the less cost you will save. And what I found from experience is sometimes management, and in fact boards, do not make decisions quickly because they're very nervous. They want more information. They ask for more information. They perhaps say, we don't believe that sales are going to be as bad as you're forecasting the sales are going to be, that the downturn will not be as bad. Why can't we wait another month and to reassess? You need to spell out what that cost to the organization is by waiting another month. As in, does that mean that we can't save 200,000? Does that mean that we're then going to have to save a higher amount of money when that decision is saved, and we're going to have to save it in a shorter period of time. That's very important to appreciate that.
Okay, I don't think we've got any more questions. It's bang on 2 o'clock, so we've done really well, Nigel. Usually these things last for a bit longer. I'm a sucker for timekeeper, so I'm really pleased about that. I'd just like to thank all of our guests attended. I've seen the guest list, and we've got people from mainly banking and finance attend, but people from other sectors. We've also had a few young people attend as well, students who are studying for their GCSEs and A-levels. And the reason they're on is because we like to share our content with the young people. So to all the young people in the room, hopefully you've enjoyed this conversation. And to all of our members and alumni and students, we just want to let you know that the London Institute of Banking and Finance is here to support you. Please do keep an eye out on all of our webinars and events which are taking on in the next few weeks. And I hope to see some of you online again soon. Nigel, thank you again for your time, and thanks to our events team in the background for managing all the technical issues.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.